Good morning and welcome to the first weekly intelligence briefing brought to you by Washington Post Intelligence. I'm Luiza Savage, editorial director of WP Intelligence, and I am thrilled to welcome you to what we hope will be your most valuable and I hope fun 60 minutes of the week. But first, a little bit about WP Intelligence and why we're here. With your help, we're creating something new. This is not traditional media. It's a premium analysis service aimed at business and policy leaders like yourselves, and it's a community conversation among decision makers, analysts, and policymakers who are all navigating global power, policy, and markets. And your voice shapes it. Your questions, whether you ask them here, over coffee, or just in a one-line email, they help guide our reporting and our priorities because we're here to serve you. So my email is on your screen, and I invite you to please use it. I genuinely want to hear from you and what you need to know about. And if you're not yet a subscriber, but you would like to see full access to our briefings, our reports, and our interviews, click a link in the chat to request a free demo, and we'll be thrilled to offer that to you. And here's what your subscription will unlock. Weekly intelligence reports, written like high-level intelligence cables with actionable recommendations aimed specifically at business leaders. Weekly interviews with decision makers and insiders, a free Friday newsletter that you can share with your team, and all of it infused with deeply sourced reporting by analysts who are also veteran journalists. And these live briefings on Friday mornings are our weekly touch base with you. So we hope to make this hour worthy of appointment viewing, a place to ask questions, to pressure test assumptions, and connect the dots. So at the end of the session, please tell us how we can do better. Now, our focus today is the Pentagon's strategic shift on technology. We've all seen that the Pentagon is radically changing how it plans, procures, and partners with private industry. And this has been a key storyline that we've been covering because along with its massive implications for both defense and technology sectors, the shift is creating new rules of the game and also big new opportunities for those who can figure out what's happening. So to help us navigate it, I'm joined by Josh Rogin, our lead global security analyst. And you know Josh from his years of national security reporting in Washington and beyond. Hi, Josh. Welcome. And since this is our first briefing, we're going to start by giving you an overview of the big Pentagon pivot and a taste of a few of the key storylines that Josh has been digging into, including the new Office of Strategic Capital, the impacts of the Golden Dome Initiative, and a case study that he did of a startup that has really figured out how to prosper in this new landscape. Then we're going to jump into this week's big story, China and AI chips, with Josh, along with our lead AI and tech analyst, Jason Dean, and our special guest, James Mulvenon, who is the Chief Intelligence Officer at Pamir Consulting, a China business intelligence company. Welcome, Jason and James.
Great to be here.
Thank you.
Thanks for being here. All right, we're going to dive right in, starting with Josh, and then we'll come back and bring in Jason and James. So, Josh, tell us about the essence of this shift that the Pentagon is making. You've been covering this from so many different angles.
Sure, Luiza, and thanks everyone for joining this morning. This year, the biggest change in the national security business space is that President Trump has endorsed a huge increase in defense budgets and set out a mandate that this money should be used to rapidly adapt commercial technology from a new set of players. And what that has resulted in is a new set of officials that are Silicon Valley or commercially native, and a new set of offices that are being fused with money to think outside the box and do new things to bring in new ways of doing business, new acquisition systems. And that has resulted in the emergence of billionaire-backed, politically connected Silicon Valley firms who are attempting to disrupt the defense industrial base. And although in aggregate, the total amount of contracts going to these new Silicon Valley firms, not all Silicon Valley, but these new tech firms, is still relatively small as a portion of the defense budget. It's growing very, very quickly. So there's a huge gold rush going on. It's a lot of opportunity, but it's also a lot of uncertainty. There's skepticism about this whether this new model can be implemented well, both inside the Pentagon and around Washington and around the community. And then there's a lot of systemic friction. And so what we have here is essentially a brand new playing field for the defense industry, and the rules are being written in real time.
Mhm. And this all started with this April executive order that really ordered all the federal agencies to favor commercial technology by default. But what is driving this? What's the urgency to make this shift?
Right. Well, I think the Trump administration, first of all, is informed on this issue by a new set of officials that come from this commercial background, or at least were investors in this kind of ecosystem. Starting with Army Secretary Dan Driscoll, a former Yale classmate of Vice President Vance, Deputy Secretary of Defense Stephen Feinberg, Emil Michael, a former Uber executive, Michael Duffy, a former technology official, guys like Doug Beck, who runs the Defense Innovation Unit, who's actually a holdover but is still there from the last administration. And they're all sort of rowing in the same direction. And their basic theory of the case is that the research and development is not coming from the government anymore. It's going to come from the private sector. And if we look at the frontier technologies of the future, AI, quantum, robotics, autonomy, all the things that you could already see taking over not just defense procurement, but really infusing themselves into warfighting in the wars that we see around the world. All that innovation is coming from the commercial sector. The other big factor here is that it's a race for control of these technologies with China, and the Chinese are outscaling. So the only way for America to compete is to out-innovate.
Right. So, as you've noted, several major tech companies have already seized this opportunity, right? Palantir with data platforms, SpaceX with launches, Anduril with drones. But you've been reporting on some of the obstacles that are being faced by dozens of other venture-backed defense tech startups as they try to walk through the Pentagon door. So tell us about some of the obstacles that the companies are facing and some of the issues that the Pentagon is grappling with.
Right. Broadly, I think you've got three big sort of piles of companies. One are sort of the traditional primes, the traditional contractors, the ones that have been around this whole time. Then you've got what I call the new primes. That's Palantir, Anduril, SpaceX. These are huge companies that spent years kicking down the door with lawyers and political connections, and they sort of broke open this new ecosystem. But now that they've become so successful, some say they're trying to pull up the ladder behind them. So what does that mean for the next 20 to 30 to 50 companies who are commercially driven, who have real commercial businesses, but are now pivoting to the defense sector to try to take advantage of all the things that we're talking about? They're going to have to figure out a new way to break in. And we can talk about how they're doing that because it's pretty interesting. But the bottom line is that it's going to be a lot tougher to build the defense tech unicorn in 2025 because the first golden tickets have already been handed out.
Mm-hmm. And I have a few audience questions I'm going to put to you, but I just want to remind everyone to put your questions in the chat. They're going to come through on this iPad for me, so we welcome your questions. One question that was submitted earlier, is this administration doing anything to institutionalize this approach? Will this new approach withstand political change? I guess that's a really important question if you're planning long-term strategic business investments.
Right. I think that's two different questions because here we are 8 months into the administration. Most of these offices are not filled yet. A lot of these offices have been reduced in size due to the reductions in force efforts, DOGE, and all of that stuff. So there's a lot of sort of uncertainty and chaos inside the system. And if you go one or two levels down, a lot of these offices are understaffed. And if you're going to inject hundreds of billions of dollars into something, that's going to take a lot of people. And that talent is really hard to find, especially when this administration is chasing talent out of the building. The upside of that is that the decision makers are really only the people who are very close to the top. And that because we have a top-down sort of deal-driven governance is what I like to call it, you can get the deals, whether or not that actually results in the contracts and the actual production and then the follow-ups that's another story. And that gets into the second part of your question, which is what's the time horizon? Because we don't know what this administration is going to do tomorrow, much less in 3 years, and we don't know what's going to happen after they leave. So when it comes to these big initiatives, any sane company, any sort of strategic company would have to assume that they can really only predict what's going to happen over the next year. And then if, let's say, maybe to the end of 2028, if you're really ambitious. So you have to think about building something or pitching something that makes sense whether or not Trump is president. That, to me, that means focusing on the warfighter, looking at what the actual situation on the ground for technology development will be over that time span, and not trying to just sort of play to whatever it is this official or that official says that they want so much, because that person might be gone within months or years.
Got it. Well, another related audience question came in. Will on-ramps for new competition be a priority as new tech titans leverage their significant information advantage over smaller companies? So you were talking about this a little bit earlier. Maybe you could expand.
Right. No, I think that's a legitimate concern, because what you see now are these big umbrella contracts with companies like Palantir and OpenAI with the military, which are sort of aspirational. There's a lot of money in these contracts, but not a lot of detail. And it's essentially a co-development partnership, which is, has obvious risks, because Silicon Valley wants to build what it wants to build, or it wants to build what's hot, and the Pentagon theoretically should be asking them to build what it already decided that it needed. But then the Silicon Valley firms will say, well, you don't know the technology as well as we do, so just let us build you stuff. And the Pentagon's like, all right, I guess we have to do that because we have no other choice. So in that kind of environment, a lot of things are getting built that may have no real, staying power or application or match with any strategy that anyone could reasonably articulate. And so if you're a company that in that environment, what you're basically looking for is a champion inside that system to latch onto your vision, and those champions are few and far between. So I don't think that the processes for encouraging competition are well established at all, and I think it's very ad hoc. And the big players have a huge advantage because they have all the political connections, and that's not just in the defense industry. That's in basically every industry that you see in the world. That's how the Trump administration operates.
Well, we are going to talk about how one startup did manage to succeed in this environment and what lessons we can learn there. But before we go there, we have another audience question. How is Anduril shaping its position in the defense industry?
Yeah, no, Anduril's a really fascinating and unique case study. Out of the big three, Palantir, Anduril, and SpaceX, Palantir already IPO'd very successfully. SpaceX is kind of an outlier because they can just, they have the sort of money and freedom to do whatever they want. They don't really have to worry about it. And Anduril is the one everyone's watching. 30 billion plus valuation, that's real money, okay? And they're producing things that are being used on the battlefield in Ukraine. The founder, Pamir, was in Taiwan recently, and they're just expanding at this huge rate. And if you watch the sort of 60-minute story of Anduril, it's a lot about hardware, the combined combat aircraft, drones, that kind of thing. But the more interesting story, I think, for our industry viewers here is the software story, because in order to really IPO at that kind of valuation, it has to be at least partially, if not mostly, a software play. And they have this Lattice software, which is meant to connect the weapons of the future to the weapons that exist here in the present. So imagine like a big ship and a satellite and a drone and an autonomous robot. Something has to connect all of that. And if that's their ambitious play to sort of break into the software space. And, quite frankly, inside the defense industry and inside the Pentagon, people have different feelings about that. And so everyone's sort of watching. People, I think, inside the Pentagon, around the community, want these companies to succeed. They're very pro-American, they're very innovative, they're very well connected, but they don't want them to succeed such that they get a lock on the business and keep the others out, because then we'd just be repeating the mistakes of the defense industrial complex that were made in the last 50 years.
Right, right. No, that's fascinating. So for a few minutes, I wanted to turn to the Golden Dome. Speaking of hardware, it's one particularly lucrative area of activity right now in the defense tech space. So just give us the very brief overview of the Golden Dome and why does it matter?
Right. Well, it matters because the president says it matters, and because he's got $175 billion of funding authority over the next 3 years to ensure that it matters. So that's the most important thing. Now, everyone who's involved in anything related to missile defense or satellites or systems architecture related to missile defense or satellites is now rapidly changing the names of all of those programs to Golden Dome programs. So if you have a missile interceptor, now it's the Golden Missile Interceptor. If you have a satellite widget, now it's the Golden Satellite Widget. And so that's a basically as clear of a gold rush as you could imagine. $175 billion with no real sense of what it's gonna be spent on. So it's a smorgasbord. It's a feeding frenzy. And but we do have clues in there about what's going to happen and who's up and who's down. Let me run through some of them for you right now. First of all, there's the battle inside the Pentagon over who's going to control it. President Trump had a press conference and he gave it to the Space Force, and he appointed the vice chief of the Space Force, a very competent general, to be in charge of it. But then yesterday, I think it was yesterday or the day before, the Missile Defense Agency came out with the first architecture. They published all these slides at this big industry conference about a 5-layer system and satellites and more satellites and ground interceptors and more ground interceptors. Is that the plan, or is it Space Force's plan? I think there's a internal competition there. And then in industry, you have, again, sort of different competing visions. And some are very space heavy and some are very ground heavy. And then you have these other contractors who are in the middle, who are very happy just to wait to see how it shakes out and plan to come in with the sort of the guts of it, the infrastructure, the architecture, all of the consulting stuff that goes into it. So I don't think we know what it's going to be, but I think that everyone is going to try to get a piece and everyone's going to fight for their own slice.
So before I move on to another audience question, just quickly on the Golden Dome, what should companies take away from how this is playing out?
Again, I think the guidance is roughly the same, which is that balance how much you're buying into the hype of it that's coming out of the White House with how much you think the thing that you're building is actually going to be useful, assuming that Trump went away. All right? Because, you could get somewhere over the next 3 years by just trying to read the tea leaves of the 5 people near Trump who are next to him. But in essence, that is a very, very short-term, very risky play. So if you can find the overlap of that and what's actually needed, and then you're building something for the Golden Dome, but assuming the Golden Dome completely goes away, that thing is still valuable to the warfighter. That's the sweet spot. So, whatever drone or sensor or, software program you're building, don't build it just for the Golden Dome, because I'm old enough to have covered the last missile defense project in the aughts, and a lot of people built a lot of things or got paid to build a lot of things that never got built, and we shouldn't repeat that same mistake, whether you're in government or industry. Just keep an eye on the warfighter. That would be my main advice.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And it's a great segue actually to this audience question that came in that wants to actually hold you to account, Josh. He says, I'm surprised Josh described Palantir's rise as one of, quote, lawyers kicking down doors. By most accounts, Palantir earned respect and increased demand for its products, first at the platoon level, and then demand grew from there. As a security analyst, does he have any thoughts on the possibility that these new tech companies are developing superior products?
Yeah, I mean, the legal battle that Palantir waged and won is a matter of pretty well-established public record. So I'd first encourage the questioner to just Google Palantir lawsuit, Pentagon. You'll find it. It's all there. But that doesn't negate the point that the questioner is making, which is that they also convince a lot of people that they have really good tech. And so both things can be true. And it was very tough at first. And I'm talking now 10, 15 years ago, for companies like Palantir to get these big contracts. It's not anymore. They did, if you're pro-Palantir, as the questioner seems to be, that the yeoman's work of beating down those doors, lawfare was only one piece of that. Lobbying, I mean, we all know the story. They hired a ton of people that had a ton of influence, names you would know. And so that's a clear matter of public record. I'm not making a judgment call. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but it did happen. Now,
it's part of the narrative.
As for the software, it's debatable. I know people in Afghanistan who say it saved lives. And I know people in the Pentagon who say it's not what they wanted. So that's just a matter of personal opinion. But the success of the company is really remarkable and really can't be denied.
Well, actually, this is actually a perfect transition to talking about Divergent, which is a startup that you tell us about the story of how you kind of came to get interested in this company. And you did sort of a case study in one of your intelligence reports looking at lessons for other companies. And this is really one of my favorite reports. I really love this one. So talk a little bit about Divergent and how they navigated this moment and what sets them apart.
Yeah, Divergent 3D is a really interesting example of a company that did two things right in this commercial tech defense space. One is that they found a real urgent and massive need, a big gap. And that gap is small mobile manufacturing. If you're at an Army base, Air Force base, on a ship in Taiwan, you have a lot of trouble getting parts these days. Our defense industrial base and its components component structure has been hollowed out for decades. And they created a box that can 3D print cruise missile casings. Pretty amazing. So that was the first thing. And then the second thing they did is they navigated this new environment that we're talking about in a really strategic and skillful way, in my opinion. I've interviewed the father-son founder team, Kevin Zinger and Lucas Zinger, and some of the investors and some of the people inside the Pentagon who are interacting with this tech. And the consensus is that they managed to figure out a way to not try to disrupt the primes, but to be the subcontractor of choice for these primes, because all of the companies that are building all the big platforms can't get replacement parts either. And then the last thing that they did is they completely changed their sort of approach to fit the Trump zeitgeist. Okay, they made friends with the right people, showed up at the right meetings, and then they jettisoned all of their Chinese investors. This was a company that was heavily linked to Chinese EV firms. They were making cars, with Chinese investment money and in conjunction with Chinese parts suppliers, and they got rid of all of it. And that sort of allowed them to get into the defense space, to get into some sensitive areas of U.S. technology they otherwise wouldn't have. So I think it's those three things make them a really interesting case study.
Well, I really commend this report. I thought it was really interesting with a lot of very specific recommendations that people could follow. Before we move on to our next topic of China and AI chips, there's just one more question on the defense tech piece that came in from our audience. Are the Ukraine or Israel-Palestine currently a testing ground for any of these newer products, or are such testing grounds not necessary anymore?
Yeah, no, I think we have more information about how Ukraine is a testing ground. I think especially the Trump companies, but any defense company is a little bit shy about talking about exactly what tech they're putting into the war in Ukraine, because A, it's sensitive. You don't want to give your enemy any clues. B, Ukraine's not very popular in Trump circles, so they don't really want to brag about it. But the fact is that when it comes to drones, when it comes to intelligence gathering software, sensors, all those kinds of things that the Ukrainians are using in their asymmetric fight against a much bigger army with a lot more resources, a lot of that is U.S. tech. Some of it is sold to like Swedish companies who then sell it to the Ukrainians to kind of like do a bank shot on it or whatever. But we're getting a ton of information from how those weapons are performing in the war in Ukraine, and that's being fed back into Silicon Valley in a really sort of massive way that, again, not a lot of people talk about, but I think is really changing the way the Taiwanese think about their defense. It's changing the way that a lot of these companies think about what could be a confrontation with China, even though there's important differences between those two fields of war. I think we have less information about how the Israeli war in Gaza is feeding into our defense tech infrastructure, although I'm sure that is a lot of the case. That's happening a lot. We just don't know as much about it. And a lot of that is targeting and AI use for autonomous decision making, and that's a pretty hot button topic. So you can imagine people don't want to really talk about their involvement in it, but I'm sure that's also being factored back into the
Sure.
system.
And if any of our viewers know, just email Josh. He'll be happy to talk to you about it. Actually, I lied. Before we get to AI, just one more topic on the defense industrial piece that we've been discussing, and that is the Office of Strategic Capital. This is a big new source of potential financing, and I think it's really important for all our viewers to kind of understand what it is. And this is an example of the kind of conversation that we're interested in having here at WP Intelligence, because this started with a question that somebody asked you while you were on a trip overseas, and you didn't have the answer. So you kind of dug in and had some really fascinating conversations and found out what was knowable, what wasn't figured out yet. So take us into this reporting about the Office of Strategic Capital and its mandate.
Right. Well, it was in the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. There was a line that says this thing called the Office of Strategic Capital is set to get $200 billion worth of financing authority over the next 3 years. $200 billion, starting to add up to real money. And I started getting questions like, okay, what does that mean? What's going to happen? So I figured it out. And as it turns out, there's this small office called the Office of Strategic Capital. It was started during the Biden administration, which was meant to do something that a lot of other parts of government already do, which is to lend money at a lower rate with less risk than you could get from like a regular bank, because it's the US government and we have all sorts of ways to lend money to businesses to things that are in the US interest or the government decides are in the US interest. But the Pentagon just never really did that before. So credit to Lloyd Austin, the Biden administration, for starting this office, but it takes a while to start things. They never really got it off the ground. They never started really lending money. And now they've got $200 billion, okay? And so what are they going to do with all of that $200 billion of lending authority? It's not actually money. They get about $1.5 billion, which they can leverage based on the scheme that I was just telling you about. And what are they thinking about? How do you get some of that money if you're a company? What are the rules? What's that going to do to the defense finance industry? Read my report to find out.
Yeah, I thought it was a really excellent report. Can you give us just like a little preview of something that companies should know about aligning with this capital?
Sure. This is not for every defense project. And basically what it's going to do is it's going to be divided into loans that are given for frontier technologies that are funded by sort of investment funds that work on behalf of VCs and other sort of Silicon Valley financing mechanisms who collect a bunch of money and then make a bunch of bets. So if you've got a technology like quantum, which is like very hard to scale commercially because it's very nascent, you've got to make a bunch of bets. And so this is really for that. So a lot of the money will flow through these investment firms. And you can see, again, in my report, which investment firms are at the front of the line. So it'll be a kind of a two-step process. And then the other big pot of money will go towards one-off huge manufacturing efforts that, again, are not instantly commercially recognizably viable. And so they need the government's help. So a big area for that is critical minerals, rare earth minerals. They already started. Their first big loan, which I think was last week, was for a company in California called MP Materials that's going to build a critical minerals refining factory because China refines 99% of the critical minerals in the world, and that's really not great. We want to do that here, but we can't compete with the Chinese scale, so we're going to have to inject some U.S. financing into it. Here's a way to do it. And so if you combine those one big off sort of infrastructure investments and then the spread bets over the investment firms into the frontier technologies, I think you get a good picture about what this office is going to be about if they're able to get their staffing up, which is a huge concern because like everywhere else, they're undermanned and under-resourced from a sort of bureaucratic level.
Well, I thought your report was really detailed and had a lot of information that I don't think existed anywhere else that you dug out. So I really commend it to our viewers who are interested in learning more on this topic. And now let's move to the big story of the week and bring in our panel. And this is the decision by the Trump administration to allow NVIDIA to sell its H20 chips to China. And I'd love to start with James, our expert guest, James Mulvenon from Pamir Consulting. James, let's dig into the details of this big news. Set the stage for us. Why was this such a significant announcement, and what does it mean for the technology export regime?
So I think, and by the way, I'm happy to be here and happy to be with both of you, Luiza, and my old friend Jason and Josh. Let's look at the big picture first. So clearly, post-COVID, we are now in an environment of global economic competition with the Chinese, and part of that has to do with strategic technologies. And the Chinese have made it clear through their Made in China 2025 plan and other national strategic plans that they wanted to achieve global in a whole range of strategic technologies that Josh had already mentioned in the previous segment: quantum, AI, biomedicine, robotics, things along those lines. Under the Biden administration, and actually in the late Trump administration, we started some very significant strategic technology controls, principally focused on semiconductors. And controlling the extent to which companies like Huawei could really build advanced chips. And we were controlling how companies like ASML in the Netherlands were selling them the equipment to be able to make those chips. As the AI revolution and the LLM revolution sort of overtook the story a couple of years ago, the attention really focused away from traditional semiconductors to really focusing on these AI chips. And the Biden administration, through a series of policies, tried to severely restrict China's ability to get both the equipment necessary to make these chips and the chips themselves from the leading company in the world, NVIDIA. And so this recent Trump administration decision to allow NVIDIA to sell 20 to China is a dramatic reversal of basically a decade's worth of strategic technology controls and policies designed to prevent China able to compete equally with the United States in all of these frontier areas.
Mhm. And Josh, you've done a lot of reporting in your most recent report about what was behind the sudden reversal, who influenced him, what was going on behind the scenes. Take us to the back rooms.
Yeah, essentially, this came as a complete shock to a lot of people inside the system whose jobs ostensibly are to manage our export restriction technology regime with China. And I have it, confirmed that this was a deal done by a very small number of people. NVIDIA's CEO, Jensen Huang, Howard Lutnick, our Commerce Secretary. Other people involved were AI's are David Sachs and Michael Katsios, top technology official in the White House. And this is a very, very small circle. So imagine that you're in the Bureau of Industry and Security. You might feel some type of way of like all of your work is kind of like disappearing in a moment. And then you add to that the fact that that bureau in particular doesn't have a full-time head, although one has been nominated, and then lost a lot of its people due to the Doge cuts and the reductions in force. And that pattern of rolling up a lot of the internal mechanisms, the bureaucracy, the infrastructure of export enforcement and export restriction policy development at the State Department, at the Commerce Department, inside the NSC. All these teams are being dismantled or shrunk or neutered. And so there's no bottom-up process anymore. It's all top-down by these 4 or 5 or 6 people. And that's why you get these huge swings that haven't been socialized with industry and sort of set aside all of the concerns of the national security community writ large. And that's just the way Trump seems to want it. So that's the way it seems like it's going to be.
Before I go to Jason, I just want to go back to James for a moment. Given your deep expertise on China, can you give us like what is the strongest argument on each side for keeping or removing these restrictions?
So to be fair, Jensen Huang and NVIDIA, the argument that they make is that this is really about global predominance in AI chips, and NVIDIA obviously is the leading element of that. And the argument is that if we don't allow them to sell to China, that this will turbocharge Huawei's effort to indigenize the development of AI chips in China, and then Huawei will then compete with NVIDIA around the globe, and that will ultimately hurt American national interests and American corporate interests. The other argument is from people who have done a lot of in China over the years, that this argument that we can get China addicted to U.S. supply of a strategic technology, and that this is a way of controlling China's rise in China has been disproven over and over and over again in sector after sector after sector where China is now dominant. And so for people who look time at the Chinese economy and these kinds of trade things, we've seen this story before, and it never turns out right. There's only one technology in the entire tech stack where China has not been able to break that, and that's high performance jet engines. And they have tried with all their might to make that happen, and they continue to try. So both sides are making these arguments, and in the national security community looks at what Jensen says, and Jensen says the PLA, the Chinese military, doesn't want NVIDIA chips and couldn't rely on them. And he's empirically wrong on scores. The PLA is already using NVIDIA chips, and the PLA already believed that through illicit channels it would have consistent access to NVIDIA chips. And so that opens the floodgate. A whole range of Chinese military objectives involving cybernetics that rely on these kinds of chips, even more so than the U.S. military, is the main national security concern about the president's decision.
Interesting. And I wonder if any of our viewers have any thoughts on that. I welcome you to put them in the chat. I'd like to move to Jason now. So there's been a lot of news on the tech front and on chips front. How does the NVIDIA chip story fit in with Trump's moves this week regarding Intel and its CEO, Lip Bhutan? Trump called on him to resign, then reversed himself after meeting with him at the White House. Where does Intel fit into this bigger picture?
Well, Intel is the other U.S. chip company that is deemed to be of critical strategic value. It's the only major U.S. chip company that manufactures logic chips. The processors that are the brains in computers, whether you're talking about CPUs or the GPUs used for AI, and it is struggling, and it has been struggling for a long time. Fundamentally, what it needs to do is split the chip design business and the chip manufacturing business. And it hasn't been able to do that, partly because it needs help in the manufacturing business to compete against companies like TSMC. And there are just very few companies out there that could help them do that. One of them that has been floated is TMC itself, which of course creates issues of antitrust. I think Trump sort of stumbled into this in some ways with the controversy over the CEO and his previous ties to Chinese companies. And as usual, sort of shoot first, ask questions later. And I think in the process of asking questions, first of all, there's an opportunistic element to this. As often happens, the possibility that the U.S. could take a stake in Intel, which Josh floated in his report and has subsequently been confirmed by some other outlets. And also just the realization of the strategic importance that Intel has for the U.S. agenda. I mean, it has been struggling at precisely the same time that leaders in both parties in the U.S. have decided that it is more important than ever that the U.S. get back an edge in chip manufacturing. Whether the U.S. government involvement with Intel is a solution to its problems, I think is something there's a lot of doubt on. I mean, it hasn't been so far. Biden administration directed billions of dollars to Intel. You can't say that didn't help, but it hasn't solved the problem. And fundamentally, the U.S. government doesn't know how to make chips, and the Trump administration doesn't know how to make chips. And so, the U.S. government taking a stake in Intel, it's hard to see how that solves that problem, unless we get into a scenario where the government takes a stake in Intel, and now it's telling chip design companies like NVIDIA that you have to start putting more of your manufacturing business with Intel. But that path leads us to being sort of more of a centrally planned economy than China in some respects.
Yeah, I mean, as you were speaking, I was just thinking about the sort of industrial policy debate under Biden and like where we are now, where it's not just sectoral, it's company specific, right? Which is fascinating. James, what does this mean for companies that are trying to navigate the risk of doing business in China or with Chinese firms? Is that risk now going down? Is it going up? What do you make of this?
Well, Luiza, and this follows on what Josh said broadcast. The watchword for companies right now that we talk to is still tremendous amounts of uncertainty. The capriciousness with which these decisions made and then reversed and then made again and reversed again doesn't give any company confidence in any long-scale timelines for making strategic decisions. And that's pretty important in extremely high-tech industries like semiconductors, where the timelines for investments in new plants and new equipment could be a decade long. In a lot of cases, I think there's a lot of freeze among other companies waiting for all of this to sort out. And they don't have any indication of any time in the future when there's going to be stability or plateau where they can actually make those kinds of decisions. Because we're talking about huge amounts of money being spent over long time scales. And they don't have the capacity to simply waste that money anymore.
And where do you think China is on all this? I mean, the background here is there's a tariff negotiation going on as well. What do you think Xi Jinping is making of this latest move?
Well, one of our great national tragedies, Frank, how much we and how little the U.S. government actually knows about Xi Jinping's decision making, and so I am cautious about trying to read Mian Bao's mind But I will say that the Chinese in general are much more comfortable with a transactional mindset rather than a US-China relationship that is based on values or the so-called rules-based international order. And so at many levels, I think they're more comfortable with the transactional aspect of their relationship with the Trump administration. It's just that I think they're getting whiplashed by sort of the social media experience. I think they made a very deliberate plan to suspend rare earth minerals to create leverage precisely to have the U.S. government lift the national security export controls that they despised so much. And they've been pretty open about that. And I think the administration got that signal. And so that's why basically they keep talking about rare earths in exchange for national security export controls, which is the negotiating sort of result that the Chinese side wants. And frankly, our lack of industrial policy on rare earths for the last 15 years is that we're in this incredibly vulnerable position to begin with. And so for me, Luiza, industrial planning is an 18-letter phrase, not a 4-letter word. And so I understand, I've spent 30 studying socialism, and I can tell you that the CHIPS Act is not socialism.
So Josh, moving to you, obviously we've been in all our reports really trying to focus in on, well, what does this actually mean practically for companies, for investors? And in your report, you kind of pulled back the lens a little bit to say, hey, a lot of other companies should be paying attention to this, whether or not they're in the business of making chips. Can you talk a little bit about how you see the larger implications?
Right. Well, I think we're living in a split screen economic reality because if you watch the markets, every time there's some sort of announcement or a trade deal or the framework of a trade deal announced, the Wall Street analysts will always say the same thing. Oh, things are settling out. We had uncertainty. Now we have less uncertainty. The stock market can keep going up. Money can come off the sidelines. And then 2 hours later, something else crazy happens, and that disproves all of that. And what I think this NVIDIA deal for 15% of their China profits represents is an extension of Trump's strategy of using tariffs not as an economic tool, but as a power tool, a tool of leverage for whatever it is that he wants. He sees it as a means to an end, whatever that ended is not based in any real economic strategy or national security strategy for that matter. He's now applying that to companies. And not just countries, but companies will have to pay a tax, a fee, a tariff, whatever you want to call it, in order to get off of his naughty list and onto his nice list. And that's just the way it is for everybody. And if you think about that, the precedent that it sets, it has drastic implications for any company that's trying to do businesses, especially in China or with Chinese firms. So all week I've been talking to CEOs in the pharmaceutical industry or the automotive industry who are like, are we next? And if you think about it, if you're a car company and your business is based on assuming that we have 100% tariff on Chinese cars, cars, you don't see them on our streets. You see them everywhere in Europe. They're apparently great cars, cheap. They're, that they're making some of the best cars out there. There's none around here because of that tariff. What if that goes away? If Baidu pays a 15% fee, that's now in the realm of possibility, which is pretty crazy. So national security concerns, economic security concerns, the concerns of American industry, jobs, all of that is now sort of subject to the first, what I call, again, deal first governance. What's the deal? And then make everything else fit that. And that's a total paradigm shift that none of us can ignore, but none of us can really fully claim to understand.
And so, James, in this situation, what are some actionable recommendations you would have for firms seeking to kind of navigate this moment?
Well, it's in Luiza because I've been working on China economic issues actually before I started doing it professionally, because my father was a salesman in the 80s selling nuclear radiation to China. So I've seen this.
Right, he was selling nuclear radiation
detectors, gamma spectroscopy detectors for bomb makers. For university departments, and then universities fronting for bomb makers. But so I've seen this long arc of U.S. business in China And we are this is a very dark time. I mean, boards are telling companies that they still have to be in the China market, and yet, whether it's in terms of employee safety, whether it's in terms of the capriciousness of U.S. government sanctions, or this is, companies that I talk to are spending as much time worried about what Washington is going to do to them, what Beijing is going to do to them. It used to be unidirectional. Companies used to only really be focused on what Beijing was going to do to them, but now they're looking both directions. And all I ever say to companies is, no, you have to be there, but there's a smart way to do China business and there's a dumb way to do China business. And we have lots of painful lessons of the dumb ways to do it. And a lot of it involves not having technology control plans in place, not having facility security and network security and personnel security plans in place. And so we're spending a lot of time at my company just helping these develop these much more sort of shields up approaches, which is to say, we're going to do what we need to do in the China market, but we're really not going to make all of these previous mistakes that ultimately our Chinese partner kicks us out of the China market and then starts competing with us globally, which is the pattern that we've seen over and over and over again, particularly with champions.
Mm-hmm. And I want to just pressure test Josh's thought with you. I mean, Josh, you made the leap from, well, an American company pays a fee and then Trump allows them to export to China. And then you were giving the counter example of a Chinese company paying a fee to export to the US. I mean, is that within the realm of the conceivable, or is that so, James, outside of Trump's, focus, which is on U.S. manufacturing and exports? I mean, he's trying to bring back manufacturing to America. Do you really think he would open the doors to foreign manufacturers for a fee?
Absolutely, because he views it as a global multinational market, and he knows that the case of the U.S. companies that they're multinational in focus. And to be honest, Chinese companies, that's daily business in Beijing. That dynamic wouldn't shock. They've already built that into the budget in their daily business and domestic Chinese economic affairs. So it would be absolutely no transition for them at all to think about it in international. And to be honest, in countries that don't have a Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, Chinese companies are doing exactly that right now.
Mm-hmm. And if I can just add very quickly.
Yeah, both of you, go ahead.
Trump has already done it. In his first term, he traded away restrictions on the Chinese telecom firm ZTE as part of his pre-negotiations with the Chinese on other matters, as reported exclusively in the Washington Post, by the way, by this guy. And then even more recently, he's in the process of totally absolving TikTok of its statutory obligations while he's trying to make some sort of deal, that's definitely going to include some sort of payoff to the U.S. government or control play by the U.S. government. So, he does it all the time. He gives Chinese companies favors in exchange for other things.
Mm-hmm. And I just want to remind our audience to please send in your questions or comments or disagreements into the chat so that we have time to get to them before we wrap up. But I want to go to you, Jason. You also wanted to weigh in.
I was just going to mention the same example with TikTok, where he made a complete reversal there. And that's where we really saw him start to talk about this idea of, well, since I have the power to make you viable, the U.S. government should get a cut. That sort of transactional, very early in the administration, that sort of transactional idea playing out for something that, was a hallmark of his first administration, was going after that company.
Mm-hmm. Well, certainly worth reading Josh's report where he really goes behind the scenes. And I think, Josh, you had a lot of reporting there I haven't seen anywhere else as to how this all played out. So highly recommend that one. And I'd like to now just move on to looking ahead. I'd love to talk to you all about what you're going to be working on in the coming week and weeks, and also what you think our audience should be paying attention to. Maybe Jason, I'll start with you.
We're looking at the connection between AI and energy. This past week or this week, we looked at the Trump administration's policy there, and really the contradiction between the full throttle support for energy for building out AI data centers at the top level, and then the complete undermining of renewable energy projects beneath that, which have been, very important thus far. So moving ahead, also looking at the competition between the U.S. and China on batteries, where the U.S. has fallen way behind. That's an area where China has leaped ahead and is increasingly important. And then also at the business models of the AI industry, which are in the U.S. and in China, still far from proven, despite how much money has been allotted to this industry.
Mm-hmm. And one of the really interesting reports that you've done since you joined us was really looking at the AI competition generally between the US and China. And I would really recommend that one to anyone interested in the topic. But can you kind of just give us the sort of high level takeaways there for a few minutes? And
Sure.
we'll
Yeah, I think
dive in next week in much more detail, but I think it's just worth putting on people's radar.
AI is a great example of the multifaceted ways that China is competing, and so we tend to think of it as a very top-down system. In a lot of ways, it is, but there is also a vibrant entrepreneurial element to that economy, especially in technology, that gets support from the state, but also is hyper competitive. And you see that with a lot of these AI startups, which have vaulted way up in the rankings. We obviously are all very much aware of DeepSeek and its R1 model that kind of slammed into the U.S. stock market like a Mack truck in January, and they're far from the only ones. There are multiple other companies that have just in the last month or so released models that are open source, open weight, and that are competing in their performance and especially in their cost for performance against some of the leading models in the U.S. And I think this is, frankly, an example that shows the limitations of the U.S. Efforts to throttle China's access to leading edge technology. Part of the success there was the ability to train with fewer Huawei chips. Now, we are seeing right now, perhaps arguably some of the upsides of that, in that the next R1, next model from DeepSeek R2 is apparently running into trouble because they're trying to train it on Huawei's chips. So it's a fascinating sort of microcosm of China's competition with the U.S. in tech.
Mm-hmm. And Josh, what are you working on next, and what should people be expecting to see?
Sure. Next week, my crack researcher Norwood and I will release a report on the U.S.-India escalating trade war. The really 180-degree turn in the relationship between the world's oldest democracy and the world's largest democracy, and what's behind that, and why India now has some of the highest tariff rates in that Trump has given anyone, 50%, 25% of which are supposed to be about India buying Russian oil, which seems suspicious, let's say, since President Trump is right now trying to strike energy deals with Russia and release sanctions on Russia and Alaska as we speak. And the surprising emergence of Pakistan as a friend of the Trump administration, which I didn't have on my bingo card for 2025. I don't know about you. And does that have something to do with the fact that Eric Trump and Steve Witkoff's son went to Islamabad and secured a $1 billion investment for their crypto investment fund from the Pakistani military? Stay tuned to find out.
All right, well, we'll look for that one. We do have an audience question before I move to James. I get the idea that all the concessions Trump is making and has made to China over the years is tantamount to his version of the old ways and errors that you've all been talking about getting away from. Is Trump behind the 8 ball? And what do you see how he might get out of this dilemma? So in other words, is he conceding too much to China and kind of trying to fix the problem and create a bigger one?
I will say that I think he's missing the bigger picture. These decisions are very tactical. and there is a larger strategic economic competition with China that this does not help solve. I mean, if you ask me what I'm working on next, I'm going back to studying how the Chinese is using all of these AI models and these AI chips to actually build a formidable military to defeat the U.S. military in the Western Pacific. And that's why I'm principally focused on Huawei. And as Jason said, DeepSeek and R2 has said that these Huawei Ascend 910s in a cluster are only performing about 60% capacity of their NVIDIA counterparts. However, one thing that we have not said that I think is absolutely critical is that China has a historic fear of dependency on these kinds of technologies, and the long-term objective of the Chinese government is not to be dependent on NVIDIA chips. Okay, the long-term objective of the Chinese government is for SMEC to become the new ML and build EUV lithography machines, and for Huawei and its network of factories and fabs, which we gave to the Commerce Department 2.5 years ago, completely violated all the foreign direct product rule and all of the entity listings and all the export controls that we had in place, and Commerce did nothing about it. That China's ultimate goal is for one of the champion companies, most likely Huawei, to become an NVIDIA. And so any short-term gains that NVIDIA is having in this market are not going to be long. And if I had an opportunity to talk to Jensen Huang about this and explain to him what's going on, my number one question for him would not be, what is your strategy in China? My question would be, what are you going to families at Arlington?
Yeah. One final question before we move to our final remarks. One of our viewers asked, and this I think relates, Josh, to what you were saying about your upcoming work on India and tariffs. Is the harmonized tariff system still the backbone of international trade, or will President Trump's selective tariffs on certain goods become the norm, even after they raise enough revenue to offset a significant portion of the U.S. national debt?
Right. I mean, the latter, and there's a fundamental tension in the Trump trade strategy explanation. Right? Are the tariffs meant to bring revenue into the U.S. Treasury? In other words, are they permanent, or are they meant to force countries into leverage so that they give us market access or buy some Trump coin or whatever it is that Trump wants them to do? And both of those things can't be true. They can't be permanent revenue sources and also leverage to trade away. And maybe there's a middle ground where everybody gets a little bit of tariffs and we trade away the big tariffs. But you get my point that none of the rules or the laws or the norms really seem to matter. And I wouldn't count on bringing a lot of like WTO cases is going to get anybody really far in the next 3 years. Now, I think the real question corporations and a lot of us are asking is, okay, assuming Trump leaves office in 2029, then what? Okay, if this is what it is for the next 3 years, uncertainty and craziness and deal making and transactions, can we ever go back? And I think the evidence that we have is to see what happened to the tariffs that were left over from the last Trump administration, which largely remains. The Biden administration didn't remove the tariffs on China for pretty simple, not that there weren't people in the Treasury Department who wanted to, but for a pretty simple reason, is because the economic consequences had already been baked into the cake. So there wasn't really a lot of benefit economically for removing them. And politically, they were very tough to remove because then people, they would have to explain why they're doing that. So tariffs have a momentum of their own. And when you break down rules and norms and structures for how to deal with international trade, it's very, very hard to reestablish them again, even if you wanted to. And, you can't put Humpty Dumpty back together again. The tariff world, the trade world that we have known our whole lives is gone. And what replaces it, we don't know. And it could be bad or good or in the middle or really, really bad. And that's what all of us are in the intellectual and professional endeavor of trying to figure out.
Great. Well, thank you all. Thank you, Josh. Thank you, Jason. Thank you, James. For the questions we didn't get to, we'll gather them and bring them to our upcoming briefings. I'll invite you to subscribe to our free Friday newsletter at WAPO, that's wapo.st/intelligence. As James told us, finally, there's some intelligence at WAPO. That's a joke, but it was funny at the time. Request a platform demo by clicking the link to the chat. block your calendar for Fridays at 11 a.m. Eastern. That's our regular intelligence briefing slot. Next week, I'll be joined by our lead tech and AI analyst, who you met, Jason Dean, to explore some of the stories he's been digging into, including the Trump administration's AI action plan and what all our industries can learn from the first wave of AI code replacement efforts at big tech. In other words, is AI going to replace us all or not? What are the big tech companies learning from moving more of coding work to AI? You'll also receive a link to this recording, and please take a moment to fill out the short post-briefing survey. Your input will shape what comes next. And until then, stay in touch. And if you've seen something this week that surprised you, challenged you, or made you rethink your assumptions, please send it my way or to Josh or Jason, and we'll take it into account. And we look forward to seeing you next Friday.